Welcome to this deep dive, presented by Safety One Source. We're the resource for safety professionals, risk managers, really anyone looking to boost their safety know-how.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're getting into something pretty fundamental under OSHA, but also sometimes tricky. It's figuring out the difference between construction work and maintenance work.
Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's actually critical. Getting this wrong can mean you're following the wrong safety standards entirely.
Exactly. And that impacts compliance, worker safety, everything. It's not just paperwork. It determines the actual precautions taken on a job.
It really does. It dictates fall protection rules, confined space procedures, even, handling things like asbestos. The wrong label means the wrong safety approach.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the factors OSHA uses. What makes something construction versus maintenance?
Right. We'll be looking at some specific OSHA interpretation letters, too. They cover things like steel erection, confined spaces,
asbestos, work over water, even hand tool guarding. Lots of ground to cover. So to kick things off, how does OSHA define construction at its base level?
Okay, so the regs, like 1910.12b and 1926.32g, they define it as work for construction, alteration, and/or repair, including painting and decorating.
Right, so the key is it's not just building something brand new from scratch.
Absolutely not. Repair and alteration are right there in the definition. So fixing things, changing things, that can definitely be construction.
So like a massive overhaul of an existing system, even though the building's already standing, that sounds like construction.
That's generally the idea. Now, compare that to maintenance. OSHA doesn't have one single neat definition for maintenance like it does for construction.
Okay, so how do we think about maintenance then?
Well, common definitions often talk about keeping something in good condition, routine, scheduled work, keeping things running smoothly.
Proactive stuff.
Yeah, and OSHA itself, in some guidance, has described maintenance as keeping equipment working in its existing state, i.e. preventing its failure or decline.
Ah, okay. So preventing failure versus fixing something that's already failed or, seriously broken down, that feels like a big dividing line.
It really is. And there's a great OSHA interpretation letter, the Minnesota Contracting Letter from 2003.
Yeah.
That digs into exactly these factors.
Okay, what does Minot say? What are the key things they look at?
Well, one major factor is the physical condition of the item. Has it deteriorated to the point where it needs complete removal and replacement?
Right.
Or can it be repaired and kept in service? Replacing something because it's failed points towards construction. Work to prevent failure, that leans more towards maintenance.
Gotcha. So patching up a small crack to stop it spreading might be maintenance.
Could be.
But replacing a whole section of pipe because it's corroded through, that's construction.
That's the kind of thinking, yes. Then there's the scale and complexity of the job.
How big is it?
Exactly. How much time does it take?
Yeah.
How much material? How much does it mess with the surrounding structures? So maybe replacing a single, small, identical part on a machine that's quick, maybe that's maintenance. But replacing a major structural beam, even if it's the same kind of beam, the scale often pushes it into construction territory.
So it's the overall impact, not just the one piece being swapped out.
Right. It's about whether it's a minor tweak or a substantial undertaking.
What about upgrades? If you replace something with a better, newer version?
Good question. That brings up the one-for-one replacement versus improvement distinction. OSHA gives an example. Replacing a utility pole with an identical one is usually maintenance, but put in a taller pole, or one that handles more load. That improvement generally makes it construction.
So even a change in specs can flip the classification. Interesting.
It can, yeah. The intent matters. Are you just keeping it the same or making it different, potentially better?
Okay. Now, what about the physical characteristics, like the height of something or how heavy it is? Does that decide if it's construction or maintenance?
Not usually for the classification itself. The physical characteristics, height, weight, material composed, they don't typically make something construction or maintenance.
But they matter for safety, right?
Absolutely. They determine which specific safety standards apply. If you're working high up, you need fall protection, whether it's technically maintenance on an old structure or brand new construction. The hazard dictates the specific precautions.
Got it. The hazard's still there, regardless of the label. Now, here's one I hear a lot. If you hire an outside contractor, doesn't that automatically make it construction?
Nope. That's a common misconception. The Minot letter is really clear on this. Who performs the work, your crew or a contractor, that's not a deciding factor.
Really?
Yeah. It's all about the nature of the work itself. Contractors do maintenance all the time, and your own employees might be doing construction work.
That's a crucial point for people managing contractors then. Okay, what about timing? Like work done during a planned shutdown, is that always maintenance?
Another good one. And again, no. Just because work happens during an annually scheduled outage doesn't automatically classify it as maintenance.
Why not? Seems like prime time for maintenance.
It is, but you still have to look at what's actually being done. You might schedule major construction work during a shutdown precisely because it minimizes disruption. The timing doesn't change the fundamental nature of the task.
Okay, so the why and what are still key, not the when. Makes sense.
Well,
One last factor from Minot. Does it matter if we call something equipment versus a structure?
not as much as you might think. The letter kind of downplays that label. It comes back to the scale and complexity.
Okay.
A really big, complex overhaul of a major piece of plant equipment that has failed. That's probably construction, even though you call it equipment, because of the sheer scope of the work involved.
Okay, so let me try and recap the big takeaways from Minot for everyone listening. Focus on, is it broken down or are you preventing breakdown? How big and complex is the job? Is it a direct replacement or an upgrade?
That's a great summary.
And remember, who does it or when it happens? Those aren't the main drivers.
Exactly right. So maybe we should look at how these principles play out in some real OSHA interpretations.
Yeah, let's get specific. The Minot letter itself dealt with steel tanks, right?
It did. Steel tanks and their structural supports. OSHA said replacing entire tanks and badly deteriorated supports was construction.
Why?
Because the sheer scale time, materials, and the fact that these things had basically failed reached the end of their life. It wasn't just routine upkeep anymore.
And that classification then dictated which specific safety rules applied.
Precisely. The letter also clarified the steel erection standard, subpart R. It said removing and installing the structural steel beams and decking during this repair was covered by subpart R.
Ah.
But interestingly, removing and replacing the tanks themselves was not under subpart R. Fall protection for the tank work fell under the General Construction Fall Rules, 1926.105.
Wow, okay. Nuanced.
Very. But work on the structural parts supporting the tanks, that was under subpart R. Safety drills need to catch those distinctions.
Absolutely critical detail there. Okay, let's shift gears. Confined spaces, always a high-risk area. There's a letter from BMW constructors.
Yes, a 1996 letter. It clarifies that maintenance inside confined spaces falls under the General Industry Standard, 1910.146, even if contractors are doing the maintenance.
Okay, so maintenance, general industry rules for confined spaces. What about construction in confined spaces?
That's different. Construction work in a confined space might trigger requirements under the construction standards, like 1926.21b6 for safe entry training, or potentially even the general duty clause if specific hazards aren't covered elsewhere.
And the letter also had something important about respirators in confined spaces, didn't it?
It did. Very important. It stressed that those escape-only SCBAs, the emergency ones, they're only for escape. You cannot use them to enter or work inside.
Critical reminder.
Any respirator needed for entry has to meet the full requirements of the respiratory protection standards, either 1910.134 or 1926.103.
And it also mentioned the responsibility of the company hosting the work, right? The host employer.
Yes. It reinforces that host employers have significant responsibilities when contractors are working in their permit spaces. Safety is a shared duty there.
Good point. So even as a contractor, if you're doing maintenance in a confined space, you're under 1910.146. Okay, what if maintenance involves hazardous stuff like asbestos?
The 2001 MAS letter covers that. It's pretty definitive. It says the asbestos construction standard, 1926.1101, applies to any maintenance or repair work that involves asbestos-containing materials.
Even if the company doing the work isn't a construction company.
Doesn't matter. If the work involves maintaining or repairing asbestos materials, the construction standard, 1926.1101, takes precedence over the general industry one. That's key for older facilities.
Huge clarification there. Okay, let's think about working over water. Bridges, maybe. The Scott Bridge Company letter.
Right, the 2004 Scott Bridge letter. It deals with building bridges over water and using things like temporary work docks or work bridges. OSHA's clear. Building a bridge is construction under Part 1926. And those temporary platforms they build out over the water, they're considered scaffolds under subpart L.
Which means specific scaffold safety rules apply.
Exactly. Including fall protection. On those work docks and bridges, fall protection is required once you're 10 feet or more above the water.
10 feet, got it. And since it's over water?
Yes. The specific standard for work over water, 1926.106, also kicks in. That means you need personal flotation devices, life jackets, readily available ring buoys, and a powered rescue skiff nearby. Extra layers of safety for that hazard.
So bridge construction over water triggers scaffold rules and specific overwater safety requirements. Lots to manage. What about biological hazards, like maintenance staff encountering bloodborne pathogens?
There's a letter from the National Constructors Association back in '92 about the bloodborne pathogen standard, 1910.1030.
Which is general industry.
Right. It says this standard applies to maintenance workers if their job tasks mean they could reasonably expect to be exposed to blood or other potentially infectious materials.
So it depends on the job task, not just the job title maintenance worker.
Exactly. The employer has to assess the risk. Think about plumbers, maybe working in a hospital or a lab. They might have anticipated exposure, so the standard would apply to them. It's about the potential exposure tied to the work.
Makes sense. Task-based risk assessment. Now, many sites have lots of different companies working together. How does the construction versus maintenance thing play out on multi-employer work sites?
Good question. The American Society of Safety Engineers letter from 1990 touches on this. While there's a specific regulation for the Construction Safety Act, 1926.16, OSHA has a broader multi-employer worksite policy.
Which says?
It's detailed in their field operations manual, but essentially it holds employers responsible for hazards their own employees are exposed to, regardless of who created the hazard.
Okay.
And it also holds employers responsible if they created a hazard, or if they are the ones who control the site or the hazard correction. So multiple employers can be cited on the same site.
And this applies whether the work is construction or our maintenance?
Yes. The policy applies broadly. If your employees are exposed on a multi-employer site, you have responsibilities. Regardless of the specific task classification, it's about ensuring safety across the entire site.
Shared responsibility again. Okay, let's get down to basics. Hand tools. Seems simple, but guards are often an issue. The Ferguson letter.
Yes, 2001. It deals with hand tool guarding, specifically in construction. The message is clear. If a power tool is designed to have a guard, you must use it.
Even if it seems awkward, like the example they use, cutting pipe inside a manhole.
Even then, OSHA says the guard must be used if the tool is designed for it. If using the guard makes the job truly unsafe or impossible, the letter suggests looking for alternative tools or work methods, not just taking the guard off.
So it's difficult isn't a valid reason to remove a required guard, prioritize safety, find another way.
That's the gist. Safety first.
All right, one more specific area, temporary electrical wiring. The Belco electric letter.
1992. It confirms that OSHA construction standards apply to electrical installation if it's part of construction, alteration, or repair work.
Okay, makes sense. What about things like extension cords on a construction site?
Generally, extension cords are considered temporary wiring under the construction standards. That means they usually need either GFCI protection,
Ground fault circuit interrupters.
right, or the site needs to have an assured equipment grounding conductor program, one or the other.
Is there any exception?
The letter does mention a possibility of a de minimis condition, basically a violation with no real safety impact, maybe in a fully completed part of a building where workers aren't near grounded surfaces. But generally, for active construction areas, you need that protection.
So running temporary power for construction or major repairs falls squarely under the construction electrical safety rules.
Exactly. And, pulling all these examples together really highlights the main theme here.
Which is?
That this whole construction versus maintenance distinction under OSHA, it's not black and white. It's really nuanced.
Yeah, definitely not simple. It seems to depend on a whole bunch of connective factors we've talked about.
Mostly, like we saw with Minot, it really boils down to the scale and the fundamental nature of the work, not just where it's happening or who's holding the tools.
And getting that classification right is just absolutely crucial for safety professionals, for risk managers listening.
It's everything. It determines the correct OSHA standards to follow. Get it wrong, and you could have workers unprotected and face compliance issues. It really is foundational.
So here's something for all of you listening to think about. How are you currently assessing and documenting these classifications in your workplace?
Yeah, what's your process?
Is it consistent? Is it accurate according to these OSHA interpretations? And maybe think about the potential long-term consequences if work is being misclassified. What risks does that create?
And to help with that, we really encourage you to go look at the actual text of the OSHA standards, Part 1910 for general industry, Part 1926 for construction.
Don't just rely on summaries.
Exactly. And the OSHA website is packed with resources. Go search for these interpretation letters we mentioned and others. They provide so much context.
Absolutely. Staying up to date on how OSHA interprets these rules is, well, it's just part of the job for any safety professional committed to keeping people safe.
It's an ongoing process for sure.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today, presented by Safety One Source.